Hey guys, welcome to our Bible study, Refuting Calvinism letter by letter. And this is a comprehensive, deep dive into unpacking and refuting what Calvinism is. And also, Calvinism is popularly known by Reformed theology and predestination. Now, this doctrine is more far reaching than a lot of people realize, and especially some of the most famous ministers and preachers and pastors are Calvinists. Most Baptists are Calvinists. Um, um, and it's like if you're not a Calvinist, you're intimidated by the Calvinist doctrine. So that you see a lot of people, their approach, that, for example, people are, it seems that they are afraid to even criticize Calvinism or to even label. Now, I'm going to say that Calvinism is, to me, a damnable doctrine. Calvinism, it distorts God's character. And that is why I am doing a deep dive in it. So it's not enough just to say it's wrong, because most people don't cognitive that. They don't see it that way. And they don't recognize. So it's hard. So that's what I'm saying. So we're going to unpack it letter by letter. Now, what do I mean by letter by letter? Well, this is the acronym TULIP. And the acronym, TULIP, captures what Calvinism is. Initially, TULIP was a response to Arminianism, and as I said, I haven't studied Jacob Arminius. Obviously, I know of him because of doing this study here. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't studied Arminianism. That's my point. But as I said, Calvinism is very much so. As I said, it is very interesting because here the guy. When I say popular, this is John MacArthur. A lot of people who know who John MacArthur is. But he is a Calvinist. Now, let me kind of go back and do my why we're doing this, okay? My introduction to Calvinism was through a man by the name of James White. He wrote a book called The Potter's Freedom. And this is the cover of his book. We have been kind of using this book to kind of get an understanding. I think he captures the argument of Calvinism. He is a master apologist. And as you can see, even under the term, the word freedom there, he says, a defense of the Reformation and a rebuttal to Norman Geisler's Chosen but Free. Now, this is Norman Geisler's book, Chosen but Free. And then notice what he says, the balanced view of God's sovereignty and free will. Now, let me just say this. Just in that little statement there kind of tells me how people approach the idea of refuting even Calvinism. Now, I haven't read Norman Geisler's book. What I'm saying is that the attitudes of a lot of people, they kind of tiptoe, in my opinion, around Calvinism. Now, James, that we in our first part of this, and I said it was going to be a kind of a long series, we dealt with refuting and unpacking the argument. And James White here presents an argument. Okay? And so we unpacked the argument. Now, the problem with when you get corralled, and this is what happens when you look at, if you look at YouTube videos, and I'm saying YouTube because our sermons, if you go to church and you hear debates, Calvinism debates, you get corralled into a thought framework. And in this case, like this book here, you get corralled into it. Now, as I said before, James White's book here, if you look at the back of his book, this is the back of his book, and you can see the scriptural index. And you have several pages where he lists all of the verses that he used in this book to make his argument for Calvinism. The problem, of course, is what scriptures he doesn't. And there's a plethora of scripture where he doesn't, and that is on purpose. So, but we're unpacking then what the idea of Calvinism is. So, in short, Calvinism, now TULIP was the response. In TULIP, this acronym goes back into, I forget, the 16th century, something like that, 15th, 16th century. This was how long this debate has been around. So this is not a young debate that's come up. But it is an acronym. In fact, let me go to, I'll give you a brief overview of what Calvinism is. Now this is, I got this from this website here, C-A-R-M, CARM. I don't know exactly what that means, support CARM. But anyway, the title of this, and this article actually came out by Max Slick in 2014. And then it says, what is TULIP in Calvinism? Now, and as you can see, TULIP, it's represented by an acronym. The first letter is total depravity. And so what I'm doing now is we're in the TULIP part, breaking down the TULIP part, breaking down the Calvinist part. Like I say, the first part was breaking down the argument, how the methods of argument here. Well, now we're actually getting into, let's unpack the Calvinism or TULIP itself. So the first thing you have is total depravity, and then unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. So that's kind of Calvinism in a nutshell. I'm going to go a step further in saying Calvinism in a nutshell by saying that, and this is, it basically says God, before the foundation of the world, chooses, before he made man. So in other words, he's going to make man, but for the foundation where he chooses who is going to be saved. But at the same time, he also chooses equally who is not going to be saved. In other words, who is going to go to hell. So that's Calvinism in the nutshell. And then what they basically say is, well, God is sovereign. Can he do what he wants to do? And to that, obviously, yeah, God is sovereign. Whether I agree with that or not is irrelevant because he's still sovereign. And this is kind of to me, the effort is to try to prove that God is sovereign. That's part of the argument that, are you trying to push up against God's, being sovereign? What difference does it make if atheists say that God doesn't exist, thus denying God's sovereignty? What difference does it make, right? Every atheist to date that has died has changed his mind, right? We would say this. So the point is, it doesn't matter whether or not if I agree with the sovereignty of God or not, God is still sovereign. But that's not even the point. What did God choose? That's the distortion. Because basically what Calvinists say and teach, that God sovereignly chooses some to be saved while sovereignly choosing some to be lost. Look at my little picture here, and that is and we're going to get to unconditional election later, but the idea of unconditional election means that if you see little stick men, well, you see the hand that's choosing one out of the six, right? So in this depiction, God only chooses one, but he doesn't choose the other. Now, the problem, of course, is that if you're not chosen, now if you're chosen, of course, hip, hip, hooray for you. But if you're not chosen, you are, and this is their teaching, you have no hope, no appeal, you are eternally lost, you are doomed. And this is, they tiptoe around that. You will find, whether it's John Piper, whether it's any of the famous Calvinists, they know this is a pickle. Oh, wow, but yet, and so they kind of fall back, well, God's sovereign. Okay, but again, we're going to go into this. Did he choose this? In other words, did God choose this method of salvation? Now, that said, if you, and of course, one question that I've yet to have anyone scripturally answer, how do you know if you're chosen? How do you know if you're chosen? My thing is that if I'm not chosen, because there are some people that are not chosen. In fact, there are, according to this doctrine, there are a lot of people who are not chosen. How do you know if you're not chosen? Because if I'm not chosen, me, how do I know if I'm chosen? If I'm not chosen, let me close this down and eat, drink, and be merry. Right? Let me just enjoy sin. Right? Because what difference does it make according to Calvinism? Doesn't matter. You're not chosen anyway. Now, I'm emphasizing that because of the illogic of the argument. In other words, if you're not chosen, then why aren't you telling people? Or is it a surprise that you die and God says, bah, you're not chosen? So if you're not chosen, shouldn't I know? Because if I'm not chosen, doing good makes no sense. Now, obviously, I could refute that argument, my own argument here, but by saying that I would obey the law so I won't go to jail. In other words, even if I know I'm not chosen, then obeying the law leads to a better life. I won't go to jail. At least to me, jail is just not an option for me. Okay. So, and of course, all of this argument is kind of silly in the sense that to make this, but again, how do you know if you're chosen? So let's kind of go back and let's, I want to continue to, we're talking about total depravity, but before I get back into this, let's do a quick recap. Now, the total depravity, which we'll come back in a moment, is man is completely touched, affected by sin and all that he is. I'll come back to that. Unconditional election. Now, points the U and the L, the most controversial. Unconditional election. God elects a person based upon nothing in that person, because there is nothing in him that would make him worthy of being chosen. Rather, God's election is based on what is in God. God chose us. Now, I don't know who the us that this person is talking about, since us, well, the us, of course, I think is those who are chosen. Now, and we'll come back to this again, because the point of what they're saying is that God only chose some. He didn't choose everyone. Okay, he did not choose everyone. And then 3, limited atonement. Because God didn't choose everyone, why waste the blood? So Jesus only died for those whom he chose. Okay, so that's why I said, if you're not chosen, you have no hope. You have absolutely no, you don't even have an appeal to God, right? You don't have any appeal. God, can you change your mind? Can you, please have mercy? No mercy. You're not chosen. You're just out of luck. So therefore, Jesus, and the reason why, Jesus didn't even die for you. So you're really out of luck. But then, if that's the case, why am I under the wrath of God because He didn't choose me in the first place? Now we're gonna unpack that more. Then irresistible grace means that the term unfortunately suggests a mechanical and uncorrosive force in which upon an unwilling subject. This is not the case. Instead, the act of God making the person willing to receive Him. Again, we unpack that. It is silly. And the perseverance of the saints says that we are secure in Christ, that we cannot fall away. Now, we'll come back to all of this. Okay? But right now, we're talking about total depravity. Let's read it. And then he says right here, man is completely affected by sin, and all that he is in nature, he is completely fallen, but is not as bad as he could be in action. For example, he says, not all murder, example. Furthermore, this total depravity means that the unregenerate will not, now understand this phrase here, the unregenerate will not, of their own free will, choose to receive Christ. Now you have to understand the importance of what they're saying. You cannot choose. You don't have the will to choose. We're going to unpack that. He says, one, it is the unbeliever who is deceitful and wicked, okay, full of evil, loves darkness rather than light, and does evil. There's a distortion of how they just presented that scripture. Look at this. Does not seek God, nor does any good, is ungodly, dead in his sins, by nature child of wrath, cannot accept or understand spiritual things, a distortion of this, and a slave of sin. Now, most of that we agree with. However, there are some points here that they distort. Now, I want to come back out of this because I want to talk about being dead in sin and what does that mean. We got into that in our last study. What does it mean to be dead in sin? Now, so last week we went to Genesis chapter 2. God commands Adam. He said, Adam, you are free to eat of all of the trees that I've created, right? All the trees that I've given you. You are free to eat of all the trees. But he says, the tree in the middle of the garden, you may not eat of it, for in the day that you eat of it, you will die. Now, we also read Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve did eat, but they did not die. In fact, Adam lives another 900 plus years before he died. So the question here, what does death mean? Now, we said there are three kinds of death. There is spiritual death, physical death, and then eternal death. Now, we're going to talk about eternal death because it is extremely important to understanding the distortion of Calvinism. So I'm going to mention eternal death now, and then we'll come back to this down the road. Eternal death is, well, first of all, the root definition, the root meaning of death is separation. So in the case of spiritual death, it means to be separated from God. I'll come back to that. Physical death means to be separated from our physical bodies. Eternal death means to be eternally separated from the presence of God. That's important because of rejection. Now, of course, according to Calvinism, you are eternally rejected from God because he simply didn't choose you. That's why I said, if you're not chosen, you are out of luck. Okay. Now, what does it mean when we say separated? When I say I'm separated from God, I'm separated from my body. Okay. So I found this little chart here that talks about what man is. And the interesting thing about man, he is of three substance or three parts. He is a spirit, he has a soul, and he lives in a body. Say it again. Man is a spirit, he has a soul, and he lives in a body. Now, man's spirit is the real you. That's the real you, the real part of you. I demonstrated that by showing you that when a person dies, okay, let me go back to this. All right, I want to show you one verse of scripture here in Luke chapter 16. And and this is important because okay, Luke chapter 16. So this story we kind of got into last time, and I want to go back and read it again because I think it's important to illustrate it. Verse 19 says, there was a rich man who would dress in purple and fine linen, feasting lavishly every day. But a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, was left at his gate. He longed to be filled with what fell from the rich man's table, but instead the dogs would come and lick his sores. One day, the poor man died. Now get this, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. Now stop. What do you mean he was carried? He died, right? He died. All right, let's go on. It says, one day the poor man, verse 22 again, the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's side. Look at this. The rich man also died. Now get this. And was buried. Now I like this because now we get even more clarity. The rich man died and was buried. So body buried, decaying, right? In fact, remember back then they didn't have very expensive funerals. Won't get into that ripoff. I digress. But they didn't have embalming, those methods of preserving a body for your Uncle Joe to get in or your Aunt Ruth, whatever, to come in 2 weeks later. Back then, when you died, right, you typically was buried that day. In other words, once it was determined you're dead, you were put in the ground that day. All right. But he says he died and was buried. In other words, rigor mortis, decay, would already start setting in, especially depending on the time of the season. Notice he said he died and was buried, right? He died and was buried. So in other words, let's come back to our looking at us. Looking at here. We experience this. Loved one, friends die, people die. And what we see is their shell, their body. And of course, I'll just say, I think everybody in their lifetime will see many people who are dead, who have died. There is no mistaking that they've died. When you look at it, to me, when you look at a dead body, you go, okay, no one's home. All right. And so the question is why? Because the spirit is separated from the body. The spirit is separated from the body. Okay? So let me stop here. I'm going to come out. I'm going to go back. Now, because notice he said The rich man also died and was buried. All right. So now, remember, man is a spirit. He has a soul, and he lives in a body. So when you die, okay, when you die, your spirit and soul is separated from your body. Your body begins a decaying process until it goes back to the dust. Right? So we know that. Everybody knows that. If you live long enough, and you don't have to live long enough to see death, and you know no one's home. Your spirit and your soul is separated from your body. All right. Now, then notice the next verse. Then in verse 23 says, so the rich man also died and was buried. Now, verse 23, and being in torment in Hades, he looked up and saw Abraham a long ways off, but Lazarus at his side. Now get that. Wait a minute. There's activity continuing. He looked up. What looked up? Well, he looked up. What looked up? And being in torment in Hades, he looked up and saw Abraham a long ways off, with Lazarus at his side. Father Abraham, he called out, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water to cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this flame. He says, son, Abraham said. Now notice he saw Abraham. So there's a couple of things here that's going to go on. Look at the next statement. Son, Abraham said, remember that during your life you receive your good things, just as Lazarus received bad things, but now he is comforted while you are in agony. Besides all of this, a great chasm has been fixed between us and you, so that those who would want to pass over from here to you cannot, neither can those from there cross over to us. Now, we can get into the whole nuance. We're not going to get into it here, but the whole nuance of what was called Abraham's bosom, or the place for the departed spirit before Jesus died on the cross. Okay. What I want to focus on here is, notice he says, remember, go back to verse 25, remember in your lifetime. So after death, and remember, he's talking to a man whose body, as they spoke, was buried in the ground, decaying, returning to the dust. And now he speaks to the man and says, remember, during your life, you receive good things. Okay, so now let's go back, because again, we need you to understand what is going on here, so that you can, when we talk about death, talk about, and then also even what salvation is, also why the total depravity goes off, goes away, goes astray. So remember, we said that your spirit, in other words, what is man? You are looking at me, looking at a 63-year-old man, okay, 63-year-old man, and so my body is getting older, slowing down, right? It constantly reminds me that I am not 20. In my mind, I think, you're 20. This here says, no, you're not. If I push it, and don't have to push it much, I'm reminded I've been on this earth for 63 years. Okay. Why is that now? Let's go back. Because my spirit, I'm a spirit, soul, and a body. My body, okay, is was 63 years old. Well, actually, in one respect, my entire being, spirit, soul, and body, is 63 years old. My body is just getting older, it's wearing down. Now, I also said here, look at this here, that the spirit, soul, and body. So what is the spirit, and what is the soul, and what is the body? So we said that your spirit then is the real you. Now, this is important. In other words, if I remember what Abraham saw, I mean, what Lazarus saw, I mean, the rich man saw, he saw Abraham and he saw Lazarus. And notice this, he also could remember there was some awareness going on there. Remember the other story from from last week we talked about the Mount Transfiguration. Okay, the Mount Transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter and John up, and his body is transfigured, shines brighter than the sun. But another interesting thing happened is that they saw Moses and Elijah. And the fact that they were able to recognize, because Peter did recognize, so there was some revelation going on there. I'm going to say, you can say natural/spiritual revelation, that they were able to tell this. That's, of course, in itself interesting too. Not only do you remember, but it seems that you become more aware. That the awareness is heightened. Okay. You'll be able to see Moses and Elijah. Now, what was interesting about these two gentlemen was that Moses had been dead for nearly 1,500 years. Elijah had been dead for nearly 800 years. And yet here they come, they show up, and they're talking to Jesus. They're talking to Jesus, and this is sort of a glimpse for us too, that there is awareness going on. Now, in the case of our story with Lazarus, remember, in his case, because he did not live right, his experience is different because he did not heed the law of God. He rejected the law of God. And so he had a different experience. But understand, he remembers. Understand, he remembers. Okay? Now, I don't think we know all of the nuances of being in hell, being eternally separated from God. But notice they remembered. Okay? So the two experiences, that one will have eternal bliss and the other eternal torment. But they remembered. And that's my point. But what is remembering, though? Not only do they remember, but you were able to have a substance to them. Remember, the rich man whose body was buried, Lazarus, the poor man who begged at his table, he died. The rich man recognized him and also recognized Abraham. He saw something, and that's my point. It wasn't a phantom, a spirit, a vapor, kind of like just floating like the ooh, no. So my point is that you are a spirit, you have a soul, and you live in a body. What is the spirit? The spirit we see is a God consciousness. Through your spirit, you are aware of the spiritual realm around you. Okay? But you are also we see a spirit has a spiritual body, which means there is a spiritual substance. In other words, they don't float around in heaven and pass through each other. Right? Elijah and Moses appeared talking to Jesus. We saw another example of that when the wicked king Saul, who went to a spiritualist, and the spiritualist called the prophet Samuel up. He came up, and Samuel, what did he see? They saw Samuel. You go, well, why didn't you call me up? In other words, he's talking to Saul. He didn't go, who am I? Where am I? There's a remembrance there. All right. So the spirit, what is man? Breaking down man, he is a spirit, right? And then with that spirit, he can see, he's aware of the spiritual realm around him. Now, man is also a soul. He has a soul. What is the soul? Self-consciousness, as is defined here. In other words, his mind, his will, his emotions, also his desires. The will is very important. We'll come back to that. Because I want you to know where the will is. The will is in the soul. Keep that in mind. But that's important when we talk about total depravity. All right, now watch this. Now the body, your physical body. We are all aware of our physical bodies. We can't help but be aware of a physical body, lest you're unconscious. But it is what? Through your 5 physical senses, the sight, the hearing, the taste, the touch, and the smell, your body, you contact the physical world around you. Okay? The physical world around you. So now, what happened when Adam ate of the fruit and God says, you will die? He spiritually died, which means that he was alienated from the life of God. Remember, physically he lived in a 900 plus years, but the being of man was alienated when he ate the fruit. He was alienated from the life of God. So look at this picture, right? He was alienated from God. And so now man began to exist. He began to exist apart from God. And it will be like if you think about a tree. You think about the trunk. And then you think about the branches. Now the branches and the leaves and the fruit receives its life, its nourishment from the trunk. Now imagine, so what happens when you pluck a piece of fruit off or you break a branch? You are alienating or separating that branch from its life source, the trunk. So if I take a branch or flowers, right, as much as some women like flowers, what happens? You take flowers and you cut them. What are you actually doing? You are alienating, you are separating the flowers from its life source. So they look pretty for what? A few days, but then they wither. Why? Because they are alienated from their life source. God is our life source, our existence. When man sinned, he alienated himself from the life of God. And so in that he began to die physically, but he was separated, thus he died the moment he ate of the fruit that God commanded him not to eat of. So at this point, understand this. The spirit, right, is now separated. The entire being of man is separated from God. But so his spirit now is dead or alienated from God. Okay? His spirit is alienated from God. Let me read a verse of scripture here. Ephesians chapter 4. Now this is a good picture here that we just read here, but Ephesians chapter 4, he's going to actually state it. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse I'll read this again. It says, this I testify, verse 17, therefore I say this and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the Gentiles walk in the futility of their thoughts. They are darkened in their understanding, excluded, now get this, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance in them, because of the hardness of their heart. Now notice that term, excluded from the life of God. All right, now all of this is important to understand because, again, what does all of this mean when it comes to total depravity? We'll get to that, but we need to understand first and foremost. So now, when Adam sinned, he began to what? Exist and live apart from God. So his spirit, think about his spirit being cut off, closed. You can't receive in from his spirit. Now, his body, Adam, was still alive physically. His spirit was alienated from God. Now imagine then, okay, which we should, because we as people we live this existence. So now go back to before Adam sinned. And before Adam sinned, he had, well, let's kind of go back to this. Let's look at this first. The soul. Let's talk about the soul. The soul, as it's referred to, and by the way, sometimes it's, most of the time, it is distinguishable in terms of spirit and soul, but they are together. In other words, you're never without your soul, right? We at the point, and I know I'm 63 and I'm very aware of my mortality, so I know that at some point I'm going to be without my body, but my spirit and soul is inseparable, and that's the difference. It's inseparable. Now your soul, again, is your consciousness, right? You can say self-consciousness. It is the mind, the will, and the emotions and your desires. How they are stimulated is through the your body, and let's say Adam before the fall, and his spirit. So what Adam would receive, he was aware of God. Okay, he was aware of God. So now that was affecting his soul, while at the same time aware of the physical world around him through his sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. He enjoyed the pleasures of life. Probably too much is what got him in trouble. But they all affected, crafted, molded the soul. Right? Okay, now, when Adam sinned, the spiritual side was alienated from God, no longer receiving life, light, the consciousness of God. So now man began to live because he began to now being influenced, being molded by the physical senses. So what he wasn't receiving revelation, he wasn't receiving anything from God from that perspective. He was receiving now consciousness, or what he was receiving from his body. Now I'm going to get to the body in a moment to show you where the problem with that is. If you want to affect someone, you have to do what? You have to arrest their will. But notice where the will is. And this is important, because this is where Calvinism get it wrong. So the will is not in the spirit. The will is in the emotion side. Remember the soul also is what uniquely makes you you. Now we may say, well, we all think alike. We don't all think alike, but we have all different traits and characteristics, likes, right? My wife likes something totally different than what I like, because what? That's her soul, my soul, okay? Now, the problem, of course, is that, and I know probably have to wait until we get to heaven, that I got to ask Adam, what were you thinking, right? Because remember, he was aware of God. Why did he change? Every human being that was born after Adam sinned. Thus, every human being was born alienated from God. Okay? So in other words, we never, we never had that awareness of God. So we lived based upon our emotions, desires, right? Our intellect that was formed by what our body, the senses in our body. Okay? So if you can condition the mind, if you can control the desires and emotions, you will overpower the will. But I want you to understand where the will is. Within the soul compartment, not your spirit. Now your body is corrupt because it's just a mechanism. Your body is just a mechanism. Through your sight, through your hearing, through your taste, touch. That's all your smell, right? Those are the five physical senses. That's what you see in the world around you. Now, unfortunately, the entire world lies in wickedness. So mostly what is influencing your physical body is wickedness, right? We know this just by the culture that we live in. You cannot go anywhere without seeing something sexual, right? What is the idea behind that? Because your body pretty much only wants gratification. In other words, you need something higher to influence your body. Your body only wants gratification. That's it. And it doesn't take much to gratify your body. Now, your higher nature, if you want to call it, higher intellect, let's go back to it. What makes you higher than an animal is your soul, the emotions, the desires, your intellect. But as sinful beings, we cave to that lower nature. We want to gratify ourselves. That's it. Now, the soul itself, remember, it has the mind, the will, the emotions. And once you kind of condition that, then you could pull your will, you can pull the man whichever way you want. And this is why you see in the world, the people are pulled a lot of ways, but it's all according to the world. Even religion, paganism. You hear the term spirituality today, but it's not. It's really just flesh. Okay? So the question becomes, when we talk about total depravity, Calvinism says that man cannot will to do good. And they never ever give one verse of scripture in which to support that. Now remember where the will is, and there's nowhere, it's in your soul. Now your soul, in a sense, is neutral. Now your physical body is stimulated. The reason why you have such a hard time with your body is because what? As the information comes through your five physical senses, you have to contend with it stirring up the need for gratification from your body. So obviously, sex, but that's not the only thing. Drugs. Your body, once you get a taste of drugs, your body says, I need to get a hit, right? Alcohol, right? Because what? Alcohol feels good. Opiate, right? The whole drug thing, why? Because it feels good, right? Food, right? Because your body feels good, right? uh, thinking of this perverted line that Halle Berry did. Make me feel good. Make me feel good. That's all your body wants. So the idea is that that's when you talk about your body you cannot fast that away. Your body cannot be tamed in that respect. Whereas, okay, body, you will never ever seek gratification. By the way, that's a mistake from a lot of people. Oftentimes when people fall into sin, they oftentimes, oh my God, how could I have sinned? How could you not have sinned? If you're feeding the beast, as it were. The key is don't go down that path. Don't go down the path of giving into the body. Because guess what? Your mind, your emotions, your desires will always captivate the will. And your body is constantly clawing. I want to be gratified. Whether it's food, drugs. How about sleeping, right? I don't want to exercise. I just want to lay here. In other words, the nature of your body is the gratification. So in your mind, you have to overpower. You have to control through your will, right? You have to control your body. You have to control the urges of your body. And many times we do, right? Many of us get up despite that we don't want to get up and we go to work. Some of you work out despite that you don't want to work out. Some of you say, I'm not going to eat this. In my case, a lot of times, there's certain things that my body, I could just eat. We could just eat all day, right? I could eat donuts, chocolate chip, dark chocolate, drink chocolate shake, eat a chocolate candy bar all day long. Donuts, let's not forget donuts, glazed donuts. I could just go on and on. Why? Because it tastes good, and my body is constantly telling me you want that. Right? It's Christmas time now. Oh my God, right? All of the delicacies, right? Not only just right fried chicken, any kind of thing, and all the food that we love the most. What happens? It's unhealthy for us. Now, in my case, I say, you know what? I'm trying to outrun diabetes. I'm trying to outrun diseases, but I cannot give into. I cannot give into my body to want to eat. Same thing sexually, right? Where we say, well, guess what? I want to be able to just have, to gratify my body through sexual lust, sexual desires. But guess how I control that? I control that by controlling my mind, controlling my emotions, controlling my desires, right? Now, and then I could sway my will to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Now, all of this becomes, what's important to understand here is, again, spirit, soul, and body. Adam alienated mankind from God. Therefore, man became a slave to his body. Through his 5 physical senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, he controls, he manipulates, he conditions his mind, his emotions, his desires, and then they will to do evil. They will to do evil. Now, the other question then becomes, when it comes to total depravity, can we will to do good? In other words, because basically, they say you cannot will to do good. This is the whole thing about, and it's bizarre that they would say that. Look at what he says right here. He says, total depravity. Look at point 1. Well, let me go back and read again. Man is completely affected by sin in all that he is. In nature, he is completely fallen. Now, while this is true, understand what they mean. Man, he says, is fallen, but is not as bad as he could be. Okay, in other words, not all murder. Furthermore, this total depravity means that the unregenerate will not, of their free will, choose to receive Christ. Now, that's where they get off. we're going to unpack that more, but that's where they get wrong, because he tells us to receive. He tells us to believe. Let me just refute that right now. And now watch this. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Verse number 9. It says, the coming of the lawless one is based on Satan's working with all kinds of false miracles, signs, and wonders, and with every unrighteous deception among those who are perishing. They perish because they did not accept the love of the truth in order to be saved. For this reason, God sends them a strong delusion, so that they will believe what is false, so that all will be condemned, those who did not believe the truth but enjoyed in righteousness. Now we're going to come back and unpack that some more, because this is the problem here when he says that man cannot choose, right? He said man cannot. Read again. Total part. Man is completely touched and affected by sin in all that he is. In nature, he is completely fallen. But it's not as bad as he could be in actions. For example, not all murder. Furthermore, this total depravity means that the ungenerated will not of their free will choose. Now, I just debunked that. But I'm going to go back to this one statement that he says right here. He says, in nature, he is completely fallen. Now, this is true, but not as bad as he can be. Now, that is true. Why is that? Let's come out of this. Why is that? Why isn't he fallen as bad as he could be? Well, remember, only his spirit is dead in that respect, but the body is corrupted. Body is living apart from God. Now, the idea that can man will to do good, next week we're going to get into showing plenty of verses, the entire Old Testament. And even now, the very verse that I showed you, on why people go to hell right there, that refuted this idea that man is unchosen by God, because man is not chosen because because God didn't choose him. Because that brings up the question, why do I face the wrath of God? Well, they would say because God didn't choose it. I'll get more into this later, because the concept of that is bizarre. In other words, I'm going to face the wrath of God because God didn't choose me. Well, why didn't God choose me? Well, he's sovereign. But still, he's going to say, but you're going to spend eternity apart from me because I didn't choose you. See, that's where the distortion comes in at. Because as we just seen, man is eternally alienated from God because what? They reject him. Which he said, well, yeah, they can reject him, but you can't choose to do good. That's what we're going to unpack. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. I would love to hear your comments. Love to dialogue with you. And don't forget that all comments are welcome. Don't forget that subscribe button. I'll see you next Tuesday as we unpack Calvinism letter by letter. We are in unpacking total depravity. See you next Tuesday. Or next week. Next week.